Before Philemon left, Teresa's grandmother gave him a cup of steaming black coffee. He stood outside the door, talking and laughing, waiting for the coffee to cool. His grandmother was the practical member of the family. She knew how to please everyone who came to the house, no matter who he was. Her snow-white hair contrasted with the firmness of her face, and her energy made her daughter seem like an invalid around the house. Regardless of grandmother's age, she and her daughter looked much alike. Both had angular faces, thin, sharp noses, and exactly the same color of almond-shaped eyes, a pale bluish color, which grandmother had said had been her father's legacy. Grandmother's parents, like the Rodrigos, had been country people, living away from the excitement of towns and cities. They loved the land and the serenity of the hills which surrounded them. With Teresa now in the house, plans for the feast began in earnest. The feast, so eagerly awaited for by all, was a floral celebration in honor of the cross, similar in character to the Feast of the Cross of May, held in various provinces of Spain, from where the custom found its tradition. It had been well implemented in Puerto Rico, especially in the towns and countryside. To celebrate it, 9 rosaries were chanted on an improvised altar, for which 9 movable steps were made. One step was added each night to show the progress of the feast. 9 godfathers, or godmothers, whose duties were to dress the altar and lead the rosary, were selected by the hostess. To set them apart from the rest of the crowd attending the feast, a small white bow was pinned on their chests. News of the approaching feast soon reached every worker on the finca. The air of gaiety mounted in each house as the days went on. Housewives began to alter old blouses and skirts, adding a ribbon or ruffle, in their efforts to have something new to wear at the feast. Even the children did not escape the excitement. They, too, took things in their own hands. The older ones renewed their efforts to help more around the house, and the younger ones managed to keep out of mischief, afraid to be deprived of the privilege of attending the festivities. One day, late in the afternoon, Gregorio and Jose climbed the hill to see Ramon and Valentin, who were in charge of building the new shed for the altar. "I wonder how the feast day will go this year," said Jose. "You fared well last summer," Gregorio said. "Where did you learn to sing those carols?" "That's the way they sing them in Ponce. I learned them long ago when I used to work there." Said Gregorio, pulling at his cigar. "That is about the only thing that scares me about the ceremonies. I can't whistle a tune." When they reached the shed, they found that Ramon was laying down the floor. "I don't see why they have taken so long to build this shed," said Jose. "The walls aren't even up yet." "When do you figure the walls will be done, Ramon?" they asked. "There won't be any," Ramon answered. "No walls? Why?" "To let everyone who can't get inside and get seats see the altar from the outside. They can sit on the grass, provided it doesn't rain." A good idea," they said, remembering how many times last summer they had to wait to see the altar after the crowd had left the shed. They waited for Valentine to put away the tools and then walked down the hill together, discussing previous celebrations. Little by little the work progressed, and then came the day when at last the shed was finished. With its new altar and 9 steps, Ramon brought 3 lanterns to hang on the ceiling. Word was sent to the workers that Wednesday the feast would begin. The day before the opening, grandmother asked her daughter about the list of godmothers and godfathers for the feast. "Let's not make it beforehand, Mama. It will be more fun to select them from the group that comes each night." "But we will have to have someone in charge the first night," said grandmother. "What about you, Mama? How would you like to wear the first ribbon?" "Why, I have not sung a feast since I was a young woman, but I believe I would like to do it again." "Very well, then you shall be the first godmother," said her daughter. Grandmother was more excited than she cared to confess. "We have to make the capias, ribbons, and the altar must be dressed, and the refreshments selected," she said, growing more and more excited. Teresa came into the room at that moment, and an idea came to her. Teresa was old enough to take some of the responsibility of the feast, especially when one of the family was involved. "I am to be the first godmother, Teresa," she said. "How would you like to make the capias for the feast?" "Oh, grandmother, do you really mean it? Make all the capias?" "There's nothing I would like better," she said. "Then get Antonio to fasten the safety pins on for you." While Teresa ran to the kitchen to tell Antonio the news, her grandmother brought the work basket and took out a roll of narrow white ribbon, thread, needles, and a carton of small safety pins. "Let's go to the neck to work," said Teresa, gathering up her work. "Did grandmother ask to be the first godmother?" asked Antonio, putting his forefingers up so that Teresa could wind the ribbon around them. Teresa wanted the capias to be real butterfly bows. "No, no. Mother selected her, of course. But do you suppose she wished for it beforehand?" "Now, Antonio, who could possibly know that? Don't wiggle your fingers. I don't want these capias to be loose." "Who else will get capias this summer, Teresa?" "I don't know that either," she announced. Then Teresa had finished making the capias. She asked Antonio to begin attaching the safety pins while she went to look for an empty box to put them in. No sooner was she gone than Antonio pinned a capia to his shirt. He smoothed the ribbon gently. "I wish I was big enough to get one of these capias," he said, unfastening the safety pin. When he finished his work, the 9 capias looked like small white butterflies with their wings wide open. Teresa had not found a box, but she had a large piece of tissue paper. "This will have to do," she said. She wrapped the capias and went to the shed to find her grandmother. "They are beautiful," said grandmother, "but why didn't you sew them?" "Because they look better tied like that, don't you think?" "Yes, I do. Come now and give me a hand here." They spread a white runner over the altar and put on the first step. Ramon brought the mahogany cross he had made for the feast and stood it on the altar. Antonio placed jugs on either side of it. "That's all I want for now, except for the flowers which I will cut tomorrow," said grandmother. "I must not forget to bring your chair, grandmother," said Ramon. "I better bring it at once." The night after dinner, Doña Anita assigned each member of the family a special job to do. Juana was to make the manjar, a dish made of milk, rice, flour, and yolk of eggs, sweetened with sugar and sprinkled with cinnamon. Lucia, Antonia's mother, was to help Teresa's grandmother with the tomato marmalade for the casabe bread. Teresa had to prepare the sangria, diluted wine with lemon, water, and sugar. Ramon was to ride to Calle and bring the cookies Lucia's husband had ordered from the baker. Lucia herself would brew the coffee for the men she knew would pass up the sangria. Next day by mid-morning, afternoon, everything was ready. A large table was brought out and placed at the kitchen entrance, and plates, spoons, cups, and saucers were piled on it. Juana and Lucia were put in charge. At sundown, the workers began to arrive, and the shed was soon filled. Those who could not find seats sat outside on the grass. There were 11 children, and Teresa and Ramon gave them the first bench, right next to her grandmother. "This will be your seat for the entire feast," Ramon said. The children were delighted. "There are lots of new faces," said Teresa. "Do they live on our finca?" "No," Ramon answered. "Have you forgotten how many guests come every year with the workers?" When they were settled, grandmother took the crystal beads off the altar and began her offering. "O Holy Cross, we who gather here humbly offer you this floral feast of May," she said. Then she began to chant the rosary. The workers all joined her enthusiastically. On and on she led them. When she reached the Adorante, "We adore thee," the workers took the leading choruses, singing with abandon and gaiety. There were all types of voices, and the merging of them, though somewhat dissonant, gave the feast the mark of spontaneity for which it was known. Grandmother followed with a Salve Regina, which she sang alone in her thin but firm voice. After that she closed with a carol for the cross. The workers applauded and thanked her for the way she had opened the feast. Those who had been sitting on the grass stood up to stretch their legs and light their cigars. But when Doña Anita stood up with the new capia in her hands, a great silence fell over the group. The children stood on their benches to see who would get the new capia. She went in and out of the line of benches as if she were looking for a special person. She left the shed and went out to a group of men who stood with Jose and pinned the capia on Gregorio's chest. Poor Gregorio, taken by surprise, almost jumped out of his shoes. "Say something, hombre," said his friends. But Gregorio, known for his political speeches, now could think of nothing to say. Vamos, Gregorio, said Jose. A capia is a capia, and you have to accept it. Can't you even do that? Gregorio bowed to Dona Anita and thanked her while the crowd shouted and applauded. Now, said Don Rodrigo, let us all have refreshments and a toast to the new godfather of the feast. Juana and Lucia served everyone, and the group spread about the place, eating and drinking sangria and black coffee. Teresa sat at the edge of the shed with the children, watching the stars between mouthfuls of manjar. Ramon kept running back and forth, bringing them extra portions of cookies and glasses of the sangria. Finally, the workers began to leave, and the family walked to the edge of the hill with them. The next day it was Gregorio's turn to honor the cross. At noon, his wife, Fermina, came to dress the altar. She added a second step to mark the second rosary and stood the mahogany cross on it. Then she spread a blue runner with a heavy crochet border on the altar and asked Ramon for an extra chair. She refilled the jugs with fresh water and put in carnations she had bought. Teresa and Ramon watched her work, wondering all the time why she had asked for the extra chair. But Fermina left without telling them the reason. Late that afternoon, the family came out to the shed. Already a group of workers were sitting admiring the altar, and soon they saw Gregorio's family coming up the hill. With them came Nicanor, the town guitarist, holding his guitar under his arm. They were followed by children, skipping and laughing. Buenas tardes, said Gregorio, taking his chair and offering Nicanor the other one. Teresa and Ramon looked at each other. This was the reason for the extra chair. Gregorio was going to have music tonight. They were glad their seats were close enough so that they could watch Nicanor play. The workers soon began to fill the shed, and again there was surplus seating on the grass. Gregorio picked up the crystal beads and began the rosary. There were no frills to the simple way which he conducted the prayer. When he finished, he nodded to Nicanor, who began to pluck his guitar. His tune rose tenderly and plaintively. On he played, and the crowd sat quietly listening. How long he played, no one really knew. They sat absorbing it, as if the strings of his guitar were magic threads that held them to their seats. Every eye was on the cross, and every mind was filled with the solemnity of the moment. There were no carols sung in praise of the cross, yet there was a carol in each of the hearts who gathered there. When the music ceased, the group sat quietly until Don Rodrigo broke the spell with loud applause. Everyone went up to Nicanor and thanked him for the music, and also thanked Gregorio for having thought of it. Music was a splendid offering, said Grandmother. Whatever made you decide upon it? I can't sing, said Gregorio. Had to have Nicanor do the singing for me. That, I think, he has done well. The third capia went to one of the guests of the workers, a young woman from another finca. Play an extra tune, she asked Nicanor. One tune for Rosa, please, said Benito, who had brought her to the feast. If I do, who will sing? Asked Nicanor. Then came a loud call for Pilar, Pilar. Sing La Borinquena, said Rosa. No, no, cried the children. Sing Flor de Te first. They had never forgotten the plight of the shepherd boy who lost his shepherdess to a king. The song was as good a story to them. Sing it, please, Pilar, they pleaded. So she sang it for them and then sang La Borinquena for everybody else. Before she had gone very far, the entire crowd joined her in the song they all knew and loved, inspired by it. Nicanor continued to play until the workers were ready to go home. So the feast progressed night after night, one rivaling with the other in originality, until the time came when there were 8 steps leading to the cross. That evening the capia had fallen to Sixtus' mother. She had dressed the altar in bright red and had filled the earthen jugs with tall branches of red berries. All morning the children had sat watching her work, dressing the altar as bright as the blossoms of the flamboyant tree. The altar was covered by white muslin, on which rosebuds of red crepe paper had been pinned. The steps to the cross were hidden by masses of rosebuds delicately fashioned. You must have sat all night making those rosebuds, said Dona Anita. Good work, said Grandmother. I think this is one of the prettiest altars I have ever seen here, Maria. I'm glad to be here to see it too, said Teresa. That night the crowd was as large as on the first night, for the eve of the last rosary meant a chance to close the feast, if the last capia was pinned on you. That was the thing many a worker wished for, when they had walked around the altar and had told Maria how much they admired her work. They went back to their benches, and Maria began the rosary. When she finished and closed with two improvised carols, Dona Anita stood up with a small box in her hands, out of which she took 3 capias. A loud murmur rose from the crowd. Teresa and Antonio exchanged glances quickly. There were 2 extra capias in Dona Anita's hands, which they knew they had not made. Who, then, had made them? And why? They were not the only ones who wondered about them. The workers, too, were certain Dona Anita had made a mistake. Hadn't she noticed the 8 steps on the altar? Had she forgotten how many capias had been given already? But Dona Anita knew what she was doing. She crossed the shed and came to the bench where the children sat behind Maria and pinned 1 capia on Ramon, one on Antonio, and the other on Teresa. The children? 3 capias for children? Cried the workers, shaking their heads in disapproval. This was the first time anything like that had happened. Why had she wasted 3 good capias on the children when the shed was full of grown people? True, Ramon was almost a man. Did they not take orders from him now and then in things concerning the finca? But there was Teresa, only 11, and Antonio, who was just 8 years old. Did they not know? They did not know what to make of Dona Anita's choice. But the children were delighted. Gracias, gracias, mamma, said Teresa, kissing her. The closing of the feast, said Ramon, conscious of the honor Dona Anita conferred upon them. Oh, Dona Anita, I don't know what to say. But Antonio said not a word. He stood in their midst, looking at the butterfly bow on his chest. Teresa and Ramon had received the 2 extra capias, but he had the last of the ones he had helped make. Perhaps it was the very one he had pinned on his chest that day when Teresa had left him alone for just a minute. The very day he had wished to be grown up, so he too would have a chance at one of them. And here he was now with a capia on his chest, and still a small boy. He looked at the rest of the children on the bench and smiled a smile of complete satisfaction and pride. On the morning following the unusual events, Teresa and Ramon were up earlier than ever. When they came to the shed, they were surprised to find Antonio surrounded by a group of children. "They want to help," he said. "All right," said Teresa. "We are going to pick ferns. Come along." "I know a place that is not far, and it is full of young plants," said Roberto. "Let's go there," said Ramon. "Lead us to it." Roberto led them to a secluded spot near the spring, where the young ferns looked like plums, and green moss stretched out like a rug. "Let's carry some of the moss, too," said Teresa. "Antonio, you and the boys stay here while Ramon and I cut some branches from the bushes. We'll need lots of them." The place was full of wild violets, and there was a row of hyacinths ready to bloom. While Ramon cut the branches, Teresa gathered the flowers and piled them near the moss the children had gathered. When they had a large pile of branches, ferns, and flowers, Ramon sorted them out and gave each their share to carry. Once again at the shed, they settled to work. Ramon brought a ladder, and Antonio climbed up to place the last step on the altar. He stood the mahogany cross on it. Teresa handed him a handful of fern, which he began to spread on the steps until they were all covered. The rest of the children helped Teresa cover the altar with the moss and the remaining ferns until not a piece of wood was seen. Meanwhile, Ramon had stood the branches around the rear of the altar. He even covered the ladder Antonio had climbed previously to make it look like a tree. "The shed looks like a grotto, Ramon," said Teresa. "Do we have to have all 3 lanterns on tonight? I wish we could have just one over the cross. I can move them further back, but we have to have them all, even though the moon shines so clear." He brought the long ladder from the woodshed and untied 2 lanterns from the rafters where they had hung. He then tied them in the rear of the shed, leaving just one over the cross. When Dona Anita came to look at their work, she was surprised to see what they had accomplished. Grandmother, too, came bringing arms full of freshly cut flowers from her garden. "It's simple and beautiful," she said. "Do you think Papa will like it?" asked Teresa. "I'm sure he will," she answered. They sat to watch the children sort the flowers and place some in the earthen jugs. The smaller ones went into the making of 3 bouquets and a tiny wreath. They wrapped them in long leaves and brought them to the house to keep them fresh for the evening. "Now to start the carols," said Teresa. "We have to teach Antonio his and drill him until he knows it by heart." "May we stay?" asked the children. "Carols are surprises," Teresa explained. "You will hear them tonight." The children left, promising to come early and see if there was anything else they could do. Though they had not received capias, the other children felt part of the last day of the feast because their friend Antonio had one. In the midst of drilling Antonio, grandmother called Teresa. A peasant had come with a box for her. She ran to the kitchen. She did not know the man. The box was square and tied with a strong cord. On one side it was scrap paper pasted with her name written on it. She did not know the handwriting either. "Who could have sent it, Mamma?" she asked, turning the box to see if it had any other marks of identification. The man had said it came from the confectionery in Cedra, but he did not know who had bought it. "Open it," said grandmother, "and stop asking questions." The box was filled with almonds, lollipops, rock candy, and all sorts of cookies. There was an envelope addressed to her, and she recognized the handwriting. "It's from Papa," she cried, tearing open the envelope. She read the note quickly. The expression that came upon her face was one of complete disappointment. She closed the box slowly. "What is it, Teresa?" asked her mother. "Papa won't be able to come to the closing of the feast. Business," she said. "Whatever is detaining him must be important," said grandmother, trying to cheer her granddaughter. "Rodrigo has never missed a closing or opening of the feast." "What are you going to do with so much candy?" said her mother, trying to take her daughter's mind from the bad news. "You should see what Juana has for you, too." But Teresa showed little interest. What could be keeping her father in town all day and part of the evening? Not to have him for the very first time she was to conduct the feast? That was the worst possible thing that could have happened. She laid the box on the kitchen table. Ramon was waiting for her to finish the carols. She felt all her previous enthusiasm leaving her. As she turned to go, Juana came into the kitchen, her arms full of packages. At the sight of Teresa, she stood still, not knowing what to do. "Come along, Juana," said Doña Anita. "We have told Teresa already. Her father has disappointed her, and not even the sight of all the candy you have in those boxes will cheer her. What will ever happen to the feast tonight?" Juana made room on the table for her packages and opened the boxes to let Teresa see their contents. They were all shapes and varieties in her selections of homemade candy, for which Juana was famous. "Oh, Juana, they are just like the ones you made for Mercedes' birthday," said Teresa, examining them. "Remember how surprised Mercedes was? Will you help us make cornucopias to put them in just like the ones we made for Mercedes? I would like to give every boy and girl who comes to the feast tonight." Juana looked at the family and smiled. She got out a piece of blue ribbon from her pocket and gave it to Teresa. "It's from Sixta's sewing box. Her mother sent it to you to tie the cornucopias with. She wants Sixta to take part in the feast tonight, even if she's away." "But where did you make all this candy, Juana?" "At Sixta's home, so you would not find out." "We will make the cornucopias for you," said her mother, glad to see Teresa's mood change for the better. "You and Ramon can fill them up with the candy after you finish with the carols. There is not much time left." When she joined Ramon, Antonio had already learned his part. She told them all about her father and the gift he had sent. She explained about Juana's candy and the cornucopias her mother was making for them. Then they went over their own carols until they too were sure of them. There was still the lemonade to be made and the long table outside the kitchen door to be fixed. Everything else was done. The platters of cornbread, meat patties, crackers, and cheese filled the wooden shelves of the kitchen. When the sun went down, the family went to the shed. Ramon had added 2 extra chairs and placed a bouquet of flowers on each. Teresa took the small wreath from the leaves and added it to the bouquet on Ramon's chair. They did not have to wait long before the workers began to arrive. They went throughout the shed, admiring the altar and commenting on the children's taste. They seemed to be in the same air of festivity around on the opening day of the feast. The workers were curious as to whether the children could turn out a good ending for the feast. More and more workers came, accompanied by some of their friends, until the shed was filled. Again, a group had to sit on the grass. Teresa and Antonio and Ramon took their seats and waited for everyone to get settled. Teresa held the crystal beads in her hands because she was going to conduct the rosary. The light of the single lantern fell on the cross and made the rest of the altar look like a forest at twilight. Teresa heard the children behind her say, "When are they going to start?" Trembling a little, she began to chant her opening. She pulled at Ramon's sleeve, for her voice seemed suddenly to be leaving her. She passed him the rosary, and his voice soon rose high and clear. When he had the group going through each decade and Teresa had regained her confidence, he passed her the beads again. She followed at ease now, on and on until she reached the end. Like grandmother had done on the first night of the feast, Teresa led them in the singing of the Adarante, and again the group burst into singing the many choruses they liked so well. When they finished and Teresa had reached the part where the carols came, Ramon nodded to Antonio. He took his small bouquet and walked to the altar, saying more than singing, "Tulips and lilies I present, and good wishes for all I beg of her." He placed his bouquet on the altar and returned to his seat. He had done his part well. Teresa followed. She sang out loud and clear, "Water for the valley and sun for our fields, I ask from you, O Queen, that the earth may also partake of your gifts, and the babbling brook that we love so well may join us in singing your praises as well." She laid down her flowers and sat down. It was now Ramon's turn. Any other boy his size and age would have felt embarrassed to go through with it, but not Ramon. He walked boldly to the altar, singing, "Violets and hyacinths I lay at your feet, bringing to a close this floral feast of May." Then he climbed up the ladder and slipped the tiny wreath over the cross. "Viva la Cruz! Long live the cross!" he shouted. "Viva, viva!" the workers cried, overjoyed at what they had seen. The children's ending of the feast was an unusual one, they all had to agree. Just then, from somewhere came the sound of music, and a voice broke into a song. Teresa recognized the voice. "It's Papa!" she cried, standing on her chair to place him among the crowd. She saw him sitting under the tree, surrounded by Nicanor and two other musicians. Teresa ran out of the shed to join him. "You did come back," she said. "You saw the end of the feast after all. I was busy all day looking for something special for tonight, and at last I found these three musicians. That was a fine closing you children had. I am proud of you." There never was a celebration like the one at the finca that night. The workers ate and sang, and when the last of the food was gone, Don Rodrigo said the musicians could play for anyone who cared to dance. The bare ground soon filled with couples twirling and laughing, dancing under the stars and a moon that hung so low it looked unreal. The children joined hands in a circle and ran about the place, encircling people and making them pay a penalty by singing a song before they freed them. Once they even caught grandmother. But their greatest fun came when Teresa brought out the cornucopias filled with candy and gave each one of them to take home. When the workers began to get ready to leave, Teresa joined her parents at the head of the hill to say goodbye. She watched them go down, still humming some of the tunes they had heard the musicians play. She could hear the children's voices, too, as they called one another to hurry up. Once she heard the word "capia." Were the children discussing next summer's feast? If they were, Teresa knew everyone was really hoping for a capia, and why shouldn't they? Maybe one of them would be selected now that her mother had made it possible for the children to join the feast. On the way back, she stood by the shed for one more look at the altar. A ray of moonlight shone upon the steps, adding luster to the flowers buried in the moss. So she thought of her promise to Philemon. "I wish," she said softly, "that Philemon will always be the best driver of the land."